So our next conversation this afternoon will discuss avoiding internet fragmentation and creating a shared digital future. This is an incredibly important topic, with the Global Digital Compact due to be agreed at the Summit of the Future in September 2024. This panel is an opportunity to discuss how we might avoid internet fragmentation and instead work together towards the idea of a shared, open, free and secure digital future for all. On the stage today, we have our chair, Casey Kalusta, industry chair and Labour Digital Executive Committee member, and Till Summer, head of policy at the Internet Service Providers Association. We're also joined online by Izan Khan, Internet Society Youth Ambassador for the Internet Governance Forum, and we hope to have Bruna Martins dos Santos joining us later if we can sort the technical issues. She's Global Campaigns Manager at Digital Action. Can you please give everyone a warm welcome to the stage?
Izan, do you want to say something just so we know if we can hear you?
Turn on your microphone.
Sure. Can you?
Great. Yeah, I can hear you now. Perfect. Well, Izan, I just can't see you, so you'll have to speak up when you're ready to chat. But I'm going to go to Till first. And to kick off, because this isn't a panel about internet fragmentation, they gave me, oh great, I can see you now. Thank you so much. They gave me the exciting topic that I'm sure everyone cannot wait for us to talk about. But I promise this really is at the heart of democracy and having, globally shared values and what things are going to look like in the future. So Till, to go to you first. Is there a universal internet? So basically, I want you to answer that and explain on a really basic level what we're talking about today.
Cool, yeah, happy to take that. Just a bit of background. I'm Till, head of policy for ISPA. ISPA is the trade association for internet service providers in the UK. There's mainly companies that provide you, me, businesses up and down the country with access to the internet. Most of my members are really UK focused. So I'm approaching this from a very sort of UK-centric view. I should say, in addition to being head of policy for ISPA, I also work for a comms and marketing agency, vice president there. But that's less relevant today. Anyway, so I'm looking at this from a UK perspective. And what is a universal internet? There probably never really was, and there probably also isn't a universal internet at the moment. But it's more prominent that is actually the case. We sort of, I think for a long time, had the impression that there was a sort of singular universal internet. And recently, because the internet has become more and more important, lots of those fractures and tensions have sort of bubbled to the surface and are a bit more visible now. And I think that's essentially, that's what you call internet fragmentation. And I think the main reason for that is really that we sort of have a bit of a clash of values that is sort of more prominent now than it was, let's say, 10 or 15 years back. And the background to that is really, if you look at where the internet has come from, who's developed the internet, it's quite often US companies, US researchers. At least that's where a lot of the money is. And for that reason, a lot of these sort of internet ecosystem values are sort of rooted in sort of a US-centric worldview that's often sort of slightly mildly libertarian in its outlook, that values, things like liberty and to a certain degree security above many, many other things. And that's then sort of clashing at the moment with all the norms and values that other people in other parts of the world have, like privacy and safety. And that was always the case. But I think what we're seeing at the moment, because the internet is becoming more important, is actually different nation states are starting to express their own values, their own norms in legislation. And that sort of clashes with this established worldview of how the internet is supposed to operate. And that is, liberty is the big target for a lot of these guys that have developed the internet. So I think that's the sort of in a nutshell, sort of background of where we currently have internet fragmentation is that you have this old school world, which is still kind of new school in the internet, which is sort of all about liberty to a certain degree. It's about security. And then you have nation states And even like individual communities or individuals just saying, actually, hang on a minute, I don't quite sign up to this old school world anymore. I kind of feel that safety should be at an equal level, or privacy should be an equal level, and you have sort of different jurisdictions doing that in a different way. If you look to Europe or Germany, where I'm from, privacy is absolutely paramount. It's right at the top of the sort of the ranking. If you go to the UK, then you find safety probably more at the top. We can go into that more later, but I'll leave it there. And yeah, looking forward to discussing this with you guys.
Thanks. As a Native American, I'm really excited to hear like the U.S. system described as like the old school way, so we're finally the old world in something. That's great. But really quickly, and then I'm going to come back to Izan and ask you a specific question. Till, when we were speaking about internet fragmentation earlier, you were talking about how it's more than just content. Because I think when people are thinking about there being different internets, the obvious thing that comes to mind is that you can literally see different content depending where in the world that you're based. So I think we get that there's that, but you're saying there's also two other ways that the internet differs. Can you really quickly tell us what those are?
I think that might be more for Isan. He has more research on this, but anyway, I think it's not just content. It's also I'll take a different approach to this, which might still be interesting. It's the way we regulate industry that differs that differs from the UK to Central Europe, and that differs from those two again to the US. There's a different way in terms of do we make. Well, the basic question is who's responsible for what happens online? Is it users? Is it every single individual user, or do you, like we do in the UK, actually say, well, it's kind of also companies' responsibility to keep people online? And I think then Isan can talk more about this. You then also look at access, and you look at I think there's something else. I've forgotten it now, but Isan, that's how.
Isan, I should have brought you in there, so please do respond to that question.
Can you repeat that just very quickly? Because I think there's many different ways we can look at internet fragmentation. And I wanted to make a very specific point on something that Philip mentioned, which is that the internet is a network of networks, but there has always been the not necessarily assumption, but reality that it would continue to remain interoperable, and there would be this ability for computers and people to speak with each other and to transmit data. So sure, we can expect there to be fragmentation because the internet is largely a reflection of the world that we live in, and the world that we live in is very, very fragmented, and there's a clash of values. But on purely technical level, I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
You're breaking. You're coming in and out a bit.
There's a suggestion we turn our microphones off in the room when he's speaking.
Keep going. Try it again.
Sure. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Keep going.
Perfect. Yeah. So that's essentially the point that I wanted to make. But I'll let you sort of clarify the question a little bit so I can dive a bit deeper into specifics.
Thanks. So I was talking about how a lot of people can think about how content can be different depending on where in the world you're located. I think lots of people are really familiar with that. If they don't understand that in China, let's say, you're getting served different content than you would be in the States, but a lot of people understand VPNs and how they can watch their favorite shows for free, right? So I think that one's a bit more accessible. But I know you were also talking about how the internet is fragmented in 3 ways, and content was just one of them. So I'm really interested in a brief explanation of that so that everyone can have a shared understanding. And then also let us know, why is this a problem? Why is internet fragmentation a potential problem?
Sure. So the work that I'm involved with, so there's the Policy Network on Internet Fragmentation, which is one of the intersessional activities of the UN IGF. They developed a framework of trying to understand and conceptualize internet fragmentation. And the way that they did that was to look at it from basically 3 different angles. So we have fragmentation of the infrastructural layer or the technical layer. You have fragmentation of the user experience layer, which is something that you've alluded to based on the content that you view, based on where you are. And then there's also a fragmentation of the governance layer. So looking at the difference between how the IETF regulates standards versus how different nations may have their own rules for internet-specific policies, so things like data protection or intellectual property and so on. So that's the way that the PNIF has conceptualized this issue of fragmentation. And in many respects, it's unavoidable that we will have fragmentation because, as mentioned earlier, we live in a society where we have pluralistic value sets. But when it comes to the benefits that we derive from the internet in terms of being able to communicate very freely and openly, in terms of being able to access information and so on, all of this is facilitated by the sort of idea that we have a one world, one internet system. And a lot of that is underpinned by this interoperability that we have at the technical level. So if we were to get fragmentation at a technical level, that would allow for basically having gateways between different nations. And it would be largely similar, I guess, to the way that telephony is regulated by the ITU, and that's something that would be very detrimental to our ability right now to be able to access information, in theory at the very least, very, very freely and very openly. So that's the risk that comes with having fragmentation on a purely technical level. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that even if we have this interoperable baseline, we'd have similar experiences on the internet. That's definitely not the case, but a lot of them are to do with things that sit at the topmost layer of the stack. And a lot of these sources of fragmentation can be fairly legitimate. For example, you have intellectual property-based fragmentation, where a piece of content might be available in one jurisdiction because you have, the licenses to sell that, but in another jurisdiction you might not. It could be because of, as I mentioned, different values. So issues like pornography that was mentioned earlier may be accessible in one place but not another. In some ways, from a more aspirational point of view, the internet is also fragmented because you would have geolocalization and linguistic diversity, which is a good thing. You want the internet to be fragmented in that sort of way because it's more relevant to what the user wants. If you're an internet user from India, for example, you'd be able to see websites in Hindi as opposed to websites that are purely in English. So in many ways, user experience fragmentation is something that we need to be able to touch upon and really be able to figure out what is actually bad fragmentation in terms of not being able to access content because of censorship, for example, versus good or tolerable fragmentation because they're based on some sort of rights respecting or some sort of legitimate concern that needs to be addressed.
Thanks so much. So censorship, obviously, and then also I can understand how on the technical level, but also the governance level, when we're talking about regulation, we know that there are very different approaches emerging about all different types of technology, from online safety to AI. And so the ability for things to be carried across networks and data and everything else that a lot of our modern economy depends on. That's one of the reasons why this is such an important topic today. So coming back towards, I know one of the sessions earlier today on cybersecurity touched on a lot of the background of the Global Digital Compact and what's coming up from the UN and why we're discussing these topics today and what the UK IGF is going to feed into on the global level. And so I think taking what you've both said and thinking through values, because that's a big thing that you've both mentioned, because this is the UK's version of IGF, and we're trying to establish our values here. If we're going to take this to, the global international forum, and it's all has to be about compromise. So where are our red lines? I'm interested on hearing from both of you. If we are putting forward a point of view from like the UK version of IGF that we're discussing today to go up into the global version with internet fragmentation, and we have to compromise with different values from different nation states, as Till was saying, where should we draw the line? What sort of internet fragmentation is acceptable, is not acceptable? What do we most want out of this? So, Till, if I can come to you first.
Yeah, sure. I think where the UK is probably the biggest outlier when it comes to internet issues is So on the one hand, sort of access for law enforcement. I'm not going to touch on that today. That's way too complicated. And also, in order to know that, you need a lot of security clearance, which I don't have. So so it's access to law enforcement is one thing where we're quite different in terms of what the nation state can do, what internet actors can do in the UK. And the other one, as I mentioned, I think, is online safety, where we had a lot about online safety earlier in the session, but even before the online safety bill, I think the UK was a bit of an outlier when it comes to how we have approached online safety in the UK. That's around, Mike can talk more about this from the IGF, how we approach child sexual abuse online, which is largely blocked in the UK. Other countries don't block that kind of stuff. They always talk about removal at source. Blocking is not something that they would ever contemplate. That's one thing we have in the UK, which we probably want to preserve, at least to some extent. There are lots of other areas that the UK has sort of, in a way, moved ahead of other countries, where a few of the European countries now follow, is around parental controls, where the main ISPs in the UK allow parents to more or less control what their children can and can't access online. Again, lots of other countries don't have that kind of system. And I think what the UK internet community as a whole kind of needs to think about is, do we want to preserve those kind of areas where we are outliers, or, if you want to term it differently, world leading? If you work for the government, then we're world leading. If you are an internet activist, then this is all awful. And if you're like me, then you're somewhere in the middle between that. So do we want to preserve that kind of stuff, or do we not? And how do you then communicate those, again, values to other countries and tech entrepreneurs and lots of researchers who completely disagree with that kind of stuff? I've got an interesting example, but I won't touch on that now. We can touch on that maybe later, where that kind of sort of came to the forefront, which is quite interesting.
Izan, over to you.
Thanks. So I think there's 3 points that I want to make in terms of what the UK should be doing in this regard, because the Global Digital Compact process is sort of a product of a really long-running series of events starting since 2018, when the Secretary General of the UN convened that high-level panel on digital cooperation. And one of the things that I want to highlight over anything else is that there's a risk that is becoming increasingly apparent, that the GDC processes, in terms of monitoring the implementation of what's agreed and follow-up, will be primarily driven by multilateral arrangements, particularly in light of the latest policy brief on the Global Digital Compact that was revealed by the Secretary General last month. And this is something that we should be pushing back against, in my opinion, because the multi-stakeholder model, whilst it can definitely be strengthened in many respects, and there was a discussion that was had in the previous panel, in my view, it does still have innumerable benefits that allow voices from developing nations, from marginalized communities, civil society, and most relevantly for someone like myself, from the youth, to be heard. And the UK government has a very good track record of supporting multi-stakeholder involvement in multilateral contexts, such as, at the ITU's plenipotentiary, by involving civil society stakeholders as part of their national delegation. And this should be continued along this path. There should be a continual emphasis on preserving the multi-stakeholder arrangements that exist within different internet governance contexts, not only in the IGF, but also things like the IETF and ICANN and so on. Secondly, and this is a recurring criticism of the UN IGF, is that it's not effective in translating the messages and discussions that are contained within it into practical action, because it's not a decision-making body. And to combat this, the Secretary General recommended this new organization called the Digital Cooperation Forum to coordinate the activities of various internet governance bodies. Now, as I mentioned, one of the things that the PNIF looked at was fragmentation at a governance level, and it's a potential risk that in introducing another organization to try to coordinate different activities might lead to that unintended consequence of creating more fragmentation rather than less, especially at the governance level. And what I think the UK should be doing instead is supporting something similar to what was proposed a few years earlier in terms of this IGF plus model, which would allow the Internet Governance Forum to bridge its messages to multilateral institutions like the World Trade Organization or the ITU, et cetera, where you would take policy messages and you would create actionable discussions in the relevant fora instead of trying to create yet another organization that would attempt to do something like this from a purely coordination point of view. So in my mind, this would be more effective. The IGF plus model would be more effective in terms of harmonizing, understanding the regulation side of things as well as the standard side of things. But we should do so in order to ensure that we don't slip into a purely multilaterally driven approach to regulating the internet. So those 2 points I think are driven. Those 2 points are points that I think the UK government should emphasize when it goes into the Global Digital Compact discussions. On the issue of internet fragmentation itself, and this is my final point, I'm optimistic that the GDC discussions can allow us to develop baselines to ensure that, at the very least, as I mentioned before, the technical infrastructure or the public core of the internet, as defined, for example, by the Global Commission on the Stability in Cyberspace, remains unfragmented and multi-stakeholder in its development. In light of things being done by China and Russia when it comes to things like new IP and so on, it may seem a bit tricky, but in my view, it is possible through very tactical cyber diplomacy with the so-called digital deciders, namely other nations who have not yet made a decision in terms of what route they want to take for internet governance. At the application layer and for content, I'm less certain that we're going to achieve some degree of harmonization, and some fragmentation, as I mentioned, is going to be present. But we should make sure that, at the very least, when it comes to things that we know are important and that make the internet function in the way that it exists today, we're able to have that as a sort of red line that we don't cross. So those are the sort of 3 points I think the UK government should be taking forward to the GDC discussions.
Thanks. I loved your point on how the UK can champion multi-stakeholder involvement, and I think that point will tie in really well with the next panel that's going to be focused on online safety. So my last question to each of you, and then it will be time for questions from online or from the audience in person, is if you were going to ask one thing from UK industry leaders or UK policymakers to support the agenda that we've just been talking about, what would it be? And I'll continue with going with Till first.
I think probably the biggest challenge for a lot of UK businesses, but also charities, and I include myself in that, is actually to be able to take part in internet governance discussions, arrangements, fora. You need to have time to understand the processes. You need to have money to travel there. You need to potentially get time or work to go there. Some of us might be able to go to get that, or you might even get your employer to pay for you. That would be the best thing, and all that kind of stuff is really, really hard. And on top of that, if you're a UK business, you also have a ton of UK regulation to deal with. So I think I know there's some work going on within government to try to build a bit more of a UK community around internet governance and standards, and this is sort of part of it. But I think the biggest challenge is just to get enough people the opportunity to actually understand and contribute, because I've done internet policy for 12 years and I struggle to understand what's going on internationally, and I wouldn't even dream of just dropping into whether it's IGF, ITU, IETF conferences somewhere. It would be a waste of money to go there at the moment because it's just so incomprehensible. So I think that's a big one. And I think for UK businesses, it's probably just making some money available for people to go there, because a lot of them are rightly quite focused on the UK, because the UK is their only market. So that might be another area where we sort of need to maybe find a way to create a bit of balance between essentially a couple of very, very engaged nation states, a couple of very, very engaged global companies, and global charities, and all the rest who are who look more at their sort of, more at the operate at the national level, but kind of also need to take part in those big standards debates. I don't really have a solution for that. It's more a problem. So not really an answer to your question, but maybe people in the audience have ideas. I would love to hear them.
Izan, over to you.
I think I largely agree with what Till was saying, and I think capacity building is one of the biggest things that both industry leaders as well as the UK government can do to make sure that we don't, go down that route of having fragmentation. Because a lot of times, what we consider to be fragmentary in nature are things that are unintended consequences of certain pieces of regulation or certain business practices. For example, having walled gardens is also another form of fragmentation by having vendor lock-in into systems, and we want to be able to encourage interoperability across all different sorts of systems, because there are definitely competitive benefits to that as well as economic benefits to it as well. And I think getting industry leaders together to build capacity to train individuals on internet governance issues that may be relevant to them or very specific to them is definitely a very positive step forward. And likewise for the government to get involved and have these sorts of initiatives, not only within the UK, but also internationally as well. And a good example of something like this is the Declaration for the Future of the Internet, which brought together numerous nation states and made a solid international commitment to make sure that the internet was not going to be fragmented, and they would do whatever they could to make sure that that wouldn't happen going forward. And there was a very concrete list of steps that they agreed to commit to in order to ensure that human rights, for example, would be preserved online, the internet would not be fragmented, and there would be a degree of certainty for how they would like to see their vision of the internet going forward, because otherwise it wasn't entirely clear what it is that they would have wanted to do going forward when it comes to regulating the internet. So I think those two things are probably my my answers. Again, they seem quite vague right now, and the specifics definitely do need to be ironed out. But capacity building and training individuals, not only on internet governance processes, but also on issues that are very specific and relevant to them, whether it's cybersecurity or age verification or whatever, and giving them the tools and the resources to be able to contribute in all of these different forums like the IETF and like the IGF and so on, is definitely a positive step forward. And combine that with commitments from governments to be able to do that both domestically as well as internationally. And I think we have a good foundation for ensuring that the internet is not fragmented.
Thanks. So summing that up, I think what I've heard you both say is that this conversation needs to be a lot more accessible. This has to involve much more of society in general, because ultimately what we're creating is the future of the internet, the future of how we communicate with each other, the future of potentially having shared values, tech being able to work across borders, like all really important things. So that's my key takeaway. And now we are ready for questions. And I know I've saw two hands, one here and one here. So we'll go with the gentleman in the front first, and then we'll go with you in the back.
Dave Michelle, I do like David's idea of us encouraging people to come here. But there's a thing in our culture that is very important to me, which is volunteering. I think I've made it clear. And I would say I saw one American-centric organisation, funnily enough co-founded by another Royal Holloway alumnus. And when they came here, they didn't engage UK PLC or our volunteer structure. And when you come here to us now, there's at least half a dozen volunteers I work with. If we put a show of hands up, well, there's more than half a dozen in the room. And remember, that's part of our culture. And when you come here, you get that volunteer network if you engage with our Royal Charter holders for free.
Okay, I'm not sure what your question was, so I'm going to go to this woman in the back, please.
Thank you. I have a question, or I have a comment and a question. The comment is, in terms of trying to get more people engaged, it's really important to differentiate between technical fragmentation, or among technical fragmentation, policy fragmentation, and governance fragmentation. I think putting it in that framework would be much more accessible because it is alphabet soup, right? The other issue that I have a question for in terms of the panelists is I haven't really heard anyone talk about the WSIS Plus 20 review, which is the World Summit on the Information Society. It'll be the 20th year review coming up or culminating in 2025. That's where everything is on the table. Global Digital Compact, the Internet Governance Forum, Internet Policy Making, multi-stakeholder model of Internet governance, the role of governments in the Internet, etc. So any comments on that would be great. And I see that Nigel has his hand up and he's an expert in that area. Thanks.
Nigel, since I know your name from here now, why don't you ask your question as well? We'll add them together.
No, yeah, sorry, Nigel Hickson, DSIT. I was just going to make, just a couple of points. I mean, first of all, on the UN IGF. So we don't want it to be a decision-making vehicle. One of the great strengths of the IGF process, and let's be real about this, about the IGF, because I feel that, the IGF is not just a structure. The IGF is a process. The messages that come out of here, there's no, it's not like policy advice you put to the minister and it'll be picked up in Kyoto and waved around. There are 150 national, regional and youth initiatives. They all participate. Last week we had Morocco, we had Ghana, we had France. This week we have the UK, we have, there's 2 or 3 others. There's national, regional and youth initiatives all the time. They're all going to feed in to the UN IGF. So it's not an automatic process. Different countries, different regions will have different priorities. We could be discussing apples and perhaps apples is not on the agenda of Kyoto. It doesn't matter. What matters is that the stakeholders in the UK come together because they want to discuss apples. That's the first point. The second point, yes, and it's good to see you again, Izan. He's brilliant. I mean, I wish that at his age I'd understood things so well, and I might not be here where I am today. But the point he makes is so important. We have the Global Digital Compact. It's a UN initiative. We have to work with it. We have to input it to it. Yes, we have concerns about the Digital Cooperation Forum. A Digital Cooperation Forum where the agenda is made up of stakeholders and then the discussions are carried out by member states is just not acceptable. In the same way, it's not acceptable that the ITU has a council working group on internet public policy, and stakeholders can go along and propose public consultations on various internet issues, but when the actual group meets, they meet as member states. These things are no longer acceptable. We haven't come, this far from 2003 and 2005 to revert on multi-stakeholderism. So those are the first couple of points. And the third point, just taking up the WSIS plus 20 thing that Dominique mentioned, yes, so we have a whole host of issues in front of us that are going to define the future of the internet. Perhaps it won't be the UN that define the future of the internet. Perhaps it will be business, perhaps it will be some other forces that, we have to contend with, and we were discussing earlier in terms of AI. But in terms of what we can do as governments, we can work with other stakeholders nationally, which we do in our various consultation groups. We can work regionally, we can work nationally to ensure that during the process of the review of the WSIS, which set out, if you like, the whole concept of multi-stakeholderism in the Tunis agenda back in 2005, that we maintain what we have today. Thank you.
Thanks. Izan, do you have anything that you want to comment on any of that?
There's a lot to unpack. I think I'll take all 3 of them, I guess, in turn very, very briefly. So number 1, on the volunteering being sort of part of the ethos of internet governance, I agree that that's a very, very big part of the culture. I myself, for example, as part of the Internet Society, I'm a volunteer. I'm not really employed by the Internet Society, and it's very different to my day job. But sure, volunteering is great, but we need to also be able to expand the scope of internet governance involvement for those individuals who may not necessarily have the time or the resources or the understanding to be able to do so from purely a volunteering point of view. And I think a really good example of expanding that from civil society is the Article 19 Internet of Rights Fellowship, which sponsors individuals to be able to take part in those technical sort of standards discussions at IEEE or ICANN or the IETF. And if we were to take that as sort of a model and implement that from government's point of view or from the private sector point of view, to have these sort of bespoke programs to get people involved in internet governance, I think that would definitely be another sort of way to supplement the current ethos of volunteering that exists, because you'll be bringing in a whole cohort of individuals who may not otherwise have had the time to get involved. But definitely volunteering is very, very important, and nothing nothing can really act as a substitute or replacement for that. That's the first one. On the second, I guess I'll take the WSIS plus 20 and Nigel's comments together. Yes, everything in terms of internet governance from the UN IGF point of view is hanging by a thread because we still don't have that renewed mandate, and WSIS plus 20 will be a very, very critical juncture in the internet governance sort of future, because it's coming at a time when you have not only discussions when it comes to the IGF renewal, but also discussions when it comes to the Global Digital Compact and the Digital Cooperation Forum and so on. And I think it's very, very crucial for us as a national IGF, and then in conjunction with things like Eurodig, which is the regional IGF, and so on, to really, really place an emphasis on multi-stakeholderism and why it's important, because it allows individuals from a variety of different perspectives to come together. And we need to be able to reiterate that at all of these different forums and make a resounding message to say that this system is working, it can be improved, but to ditch the system completely or to try to water down the system in order to make it so that internet-related policy discussions are happening at a nation-state level is something that's not really acceptable to us, as Nigel mentioned. And I feel very, very strongly about that as well, because sure, right now, for example, you may have at the IETF individuals that overwhelmingly represent a particular private sector stakeholder group, or at the IGF, for example, you may have overwhelming civil society representation, but not enough nation-state representation, and so on. But there's different ways that we can enhance participation and cooperation without having to ditch everything that we've worked on so far and move purely towards a multilateral system, which is something that only really benefits nation states that have a vested interest in controlling the internet as opposed to letting it flourish. And as I mentioned, the states that we see that are trying to bring policy and standards discussions to multilateral fora are countries like China and Russia, which are trying to introduce things like new IP, which would make surveillance much easier, and the ability to route packets and so on purely discretionary on their own sort of remits and standards, as opposed to having this purely neutral conduit of networks and so on that allows information to travel more freely, which is what we have right now. So I think that covers off everything, but if there's anything that I missed, I'm very happy to have discussion separately on that as well.
No, really good, thanks. I'll take another few questions in case we have any. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. I had the privilege of going to Eurodig a few weeks ago, and I think we spent roughly half a day on internet fragmentation. To simplify but hopefully not misrepresent things, it felt to me like the position of some of the ISOC team that were there, mainly from the Secretariat, was much less nuanced than I've heard today. In terms of almost, we must avoid fragmentation at all costs, ignoring the historical sort of evolution of the internet, the fact it was a network of networks, not a homogeneous network, etc. So not a question, more a comment. I think it's really pleasing to hear a more nuanced discussion, because I think if we accept the avoidance of fragmentation at all costs, then we do have the imposition of the lowest common denominator when it gets to things like governance, regulation, etc. And frankly, I would personally not want to have the sort of US lack of federal privacy, or the imposition of Section 230 and the inability to control misinformation, etc. So I just welcome the comments from Izan and that much more nuanced approach to it. And I think we need to try and get that communicated into the Secretariat in the Internet Society, because they're taking a far too simplistic view, in my opinion. Thank you.
And then,
Sorry, very quickly, comment on that case. Yeah, and I mean, thanks, Andrew, for the comment. I mean, I don't claim to represent the Internet Society. I'm just a youth ambassador. And I'm sure, I did see your questions and your participation in Eurodig as well. It's important to understand that, sure, we need to have more nuanced and more realistic discussions in terms of, what fragmentation is. It's fine to have a an opinionated position that we should avoid fragmentation, maybe at all costs, is a bit extreme in my point of view, because realistically, the fight for the internet is the fight for values, as we've constantly mentioned in the course of this panel. But I want to say, without any for the avoidance of all doubt, that most, if not all, actors in the internet governance space, and especially the internet society, agree that technical fragmentation is the red line. We can't have technical fragmentation, because if that were to be the case, then we wouldn't have an internet anymore. The idea that, sure, the internet is not homogeneous, it's very heterogeneous, and it has a lot of these differences and so on, is true from a user experience point of view, but from a purely underlying technical point of view, the TCP/IP protocols and all of the other protocols that allow packets to be routed, like BGP and so on, are standards that have been commonly and widely accepted, that allow the internet to function. And that, I think, is the when it comes to discussions in the GDC and avoiding internet fragmentation, sure, many people disagree on what fragmentation actually is, but the one common denominator that, as you mentioned, may potentially be a bad thing, but I think is a good thing, is that technical fragmentation should be avoided at all costs. Over and above that, things that the Internet Society may be doing when it comes to impact assessments and maybe looking at content level fragmentation is up for debate in terms of whether that's something that could be acceptable or not. But when it comes to gauging that level of acceptability, we need to have a framework. And I think that's the most important thing that I feel is lacking in these discussions, because whether we want to look at something specific like the online, safety bill or something, and whether that could be considered fragmentation or not, is besides the point. We don't really have a perspective or a framework that's rigorous enough to be able to measure and understand whether it can be reasonably considered fragmentation or not. And I think the UNESCO Rome Principles offers a very good starting point, right? If something is rights respecting, open, accessible, and multi-stakeholder driven, then whether that potentially leads to something that may be considered fragmentary or not is besides the point, because as long as it meets the universality indicators, then it should be fine. And that allows us to have this degree of plurality when it comes to internet governance, because as Nigel mentioned, we may be interested in apples, and people in other parts of the world may be interested in oranges and so on. But if we have a common language and a common framework to be able to understand fragmentation, I think that would be getting us way, way further in the discussion than having, as you may be, rightfully observing, very, very sort of maybe potentially politicized or very emphatic discussions that may not, necessarily, where substance may still be wanting, in my point of view. But yes, I thank you for the comment on that. Thank you.
Unless there are any burning questions from online, then I think I'll give the last question to Bill.
Oh, thank you. I'm Bill from Nominet. So I was interested in your mentioning the Declaration for the Future of the Internet, because I've read it, and I thought, gosh, what a sensible document. But it's also notable as to which nations signed up, and it's also notable that it's sort of came into being sort of through some strange process, which was sort of somewhat different. So I wonder whether you feel that that is a genuine positive contribution towards all of the nations coming together around what on earth is supposed to be going on around the internet, or whether it's actually a symptom of the fragmentation of the governance of the internet, and what your thoughts were on that.
Till, I know we didn't come to you yet, so that, or any final points you want to make?
No, I guess my point around all of this, I admire the sort of the enthusiasm in the room, and Nigel's the best example for that, the absolute passion for the IGF processes. But I guess I mentioned this early on, I'm an industry lobbyist, mainly UK businesses. So I'm approaching this completely from the other point of view, and that is, this is all quite sort of theoretical. It's all quite worthy. It's all quite grand. It's all really, really important, and and we need to spend time on that. But it's sort of at a sort of like individual citizen level or just a business level. You sort of like realities keep crushing against this sort of these lofty ideals of internet governance and multi-stakeholder frameworks. And so yes, we need to do the research and we need to find frameworks, but then in the UK we will have the online safety bill, and that clashes with some of the ideas and some of the standards that have been developed elsewhere. How do we solve that? That will be that's for me is the sort of more interesting way, and I think it's sort of, I think it will be important down the line to sort of build a bridge between these really, really important governance and to some degree theoretical debates and actually what happens to people online or on the ground in the UK, in Germany, in the States. How do they experience the internet? So I think it's important to not sort of lose track of that. And I think what's also important there, and I think Dominic sort of coming at this from a different perspective, there's this sort of idea that policy is just policy and technical is just technical. I think that's fundamentally wrong, because policy drives technical standards, and technical standards are often driven with or implemented with a policy idea in mind. So this idea that you can just sort of separate policy discussions, technological tech discussions, and they don't really have anything to do with each other is probably not true anymore, and is creating lots of problems again around online safety in other areas. So I guess just to sort of sum that up, fascinating discussion, fascinating enthusiasm, really, really important stuff. But how do you, like, my challenge anyway to the people in the room is how do you break that down to, people who don't have the time to learn the processes, learn the acronyms, learn the, I don't know how many organizations there are, 10, 20, I don't know how many we've mentioned today. It's really, really hard. And how do you get other people involved? That's my challenge in a way.
Thanks. Izan, do you want to come back to what Bill asked and also any final points?
Sure. And this was exactly the same question that I had when I had the opportunity to speak with somebody from the European Commission on this, because there were many, many comments, and especially during last year's IGF as well, where Tim Wu, amongst others from the US government, introduced this DFI on how they approached the bringing of different nations together to create and basically sign this declaration. And in many ways, my initial opinion was that, yes, this can potentially be seen as fragmenting the internet more, because you have like very, very clear set of like commitments that these countries have signed up to that many other countries may not necessarily want to. And I think that, as I mentioned when I made my first couple of points, cyber diplomacy is going to be of very increasing importance in the next couple of years, because even though there are many countries that are ostensibly not signatories to the document, and that were not included in the initial sort of like discussions, there are many, many nations that are considered digital deciders and are yet to make a stand on whether they want to adopt an authoritarian approach to regulating the internet or a more sort of rights respecting approach as contained in the DFI. And sure, you can look at the DFI and criticize it in many ways for example, not being multi-stakeholder, or for it not including many key nations, for example, like those in the global south, like India and so on. But I think that this is more to indicate where it is that they stand, because for those nations that did sign up to it, this wasn't necessarily clear at the very, very outset. It was contained in other documents and so on. For example, you have the Charter of Fundamental Rights in the EU, and you have like other similar, documents and so on from other countries. But for all of them to come together and to state in no uncertain terms that this is how they view the internet going forward, I think was a very positive step in terms of drawing the line in the sand. And now you have the hard work of being able to convince other nations to sign up to, even if it's not the entire thing, at least a version that is closer to that than the authoritarian version, which is something that's put forward by other nation states. So that's in response to that question. Is it fragmentary? Potentially, but the real fragmentation will only be seen going forward, because this is just the starting point, and it may potentially lead to a version of the internet that is actually far more rights respecting. We just don't know yet, but it's very important to be able to identify where it is that those countries stood. That's my opinion on it. And this is an opinion that, after speaking to a bunch of different individuals who were involved in the creation of this document, has slowly sort of changed my opinion from it being basically a document full of nothingness to a document that, if it actually gives people the ability, gives countries the ability to indicate where they stand and to stick to those commitments or be called out for not meeting those commitments, I think it's a positive step forward. In terms of final point, as I mentioned earlier, and I want to be able to reiterate, we're at a very critical juncture when it comes to internet governance. And, as Till mentioned continuously, the internet governance ecosystem can be very, very difficult to break into. So if there's one thing that we in the UK IGF want to be able to take away, it's to be able to educate and build capacity when it comes to taking part in these internet governance processes, whether it's from a total point of view, understanding all of the different acronyms, or whether it's being guided to the right forums to discuss things that are relevant to you. We need to create those structures and facilitate those discussions in the appropriate fora. And I think this should be a very, very key point to take away for not only the government, but also people in technical communities, people in the private sector, and people in civil society as well. And I think that is my final point. Thank you.
Thanks. That was a great point to end on. And can I say thank you to both my panelists, especially doing a fabulous job virtually. And thanks to Nominet for hosting this discussion.